session, and I'm sure you'll find that you'll have loads of reasons to stay awake and stay alert. It gives me such great pleasure to introduce Professor Rob Kitchin, who, if you don't know Rob's work and you're in this room, you've probably been living under a rock. I mean, Rob, as we know, is a prolific author, not just an academic author, but also a fiction author, crime fiction author. But that's another conversation, possibly over dinner tonight. So Rob is a professor at Maynooth University at the Social Sciences Institute, and he's also at the Department of Geography. He's a founding editor of Dialogues in Digital Society. I keep on getting that wrong. And I mean, his publications are just extraordinarily broad and enriching, and I have just used so many of them in my work, as I'm sure many of you have as well. So it's a great pleasure, Rob, to introduce you, and I hope that wasn't too long, because I'm scared of that thing over there.
Do I need to use this? I'm probably loud enough, I think. Oh. Yeah, I'm fine. Grand. Okay, great. So this is going to be very fast, because I'm going to try and take 3 10,000-word papers and make them into one presentation. So I'm going to briefly start by just introducing the project that this is coming off of. So we have an ERC-funded project called Data Stories. We just finished year 3. And basically what we're doing is looking at the evidence base for housing, planning, property. Obviously these data are really central to how places are understood and managed. They're guiding, informing government policy, they're shaping public perception, they're guiding billions of euros in investments, using a whole load of stuff from land use and development, public-private housing, homelessness, commercial real estate, infrastructure development, and so on. And effectively what we're doing is taking a critical data studies approach and applying it onto kind of housing planning and so on. And I won't go through the team over there, but you can see there's a whole bunch of us working on this, including 7 artists. So it's been done in 2 phases. In the first phase, what we've been trying to do is map that entire data ecosystem. So not just one part of it, like land or planning, but like pretty much all the data we can find around kind of property, housing, and so on. And we've done a whole load of interviews. So we've done about 125 recording interviews in this phase. With about 78 different organisations, a whole bunch of informal meetings, because there's a whole load of organisations that just won't go on the record, but they will talk to us. And then we've done a whole load of data audits where we try to work out what data are held by different organisations. And effectively, this is the ecosystem that we've kind of mapped out. So this is basically what we think is the kind of data holdings around for a particular city, but it pretty much holds for the country. So a whole set of data around stock use, occupancy management, a whole load around the development pipeline from land through vacancy, through planning, construction, and the labour for all of that, a whole load around market finance costs, some stuff around housing need and demand, housing experiences, infrastructure, environmental stuff around the environment, but also around sustainability, and a whole load of historical stuff around archives going back to whenever. And then what we've been trying to do is work out who is holding this data. And so we have a spreadsheet that's kind of however long, that's got kind of 300 different longitudinal data sets in it, where we've worked out basically who is holding what variables within each of those kind of databases. So we have about 300 longitudinal data sets, split across about 123 open data sites of various kinds. And the bits in red are bits that all of our stakeholders from our interviews and some workshops have basically said, we really like data about this and we've tried to find it and haven't been able to. So these are the gaps or the missing elements. Now this spreadsheet goes on for 500 odd lines. So if we were to do it by per variable, it would be thousands of lines long. And then we have a second set of case studies. So this is phase 2, is 11 case studies, where we've taken particular elements and then we're trying to kind of go into more depth. And what I'm going to present about is one of these, which is this kind of state planning data ecosystem. It pulls a little bit on this planning data company. We're just coming up to the end of the second year, so these are ongoing. These are those ones over there split over 2 lines, 2 years. And part of our idea is, I'm not sure what this is we're For each of those case studies, we're trying to kind of tell 3 data stories. One is told by us as a team, one is told by our artists, and one is told by our stakeholder working with our artists and working with us. This is the idea. So we've been kind of playing around with some of this visualization stuff. We have a very large 3D printed model of 7 kilometres by 4 kilometres in the middle of Dublin. So the model is probably from here to the door and the height of the screen to the floor. We have a data projection, we can throw the data on. So it's kind of something you can kind of stand around and see. It's a 3D printed model we've been playing around with. These are some of our workshops, and we've had pretty good access. So, for example, on this table, there's somebody here from the central bank, from the Taoiseach's office, which is the Prime Minister's office, Department of Housing, Housing Agency, Local Management Agency. There's a bunch of bankers and finance people here. There's a bunch of civil society people in the background. And they have helped us construct that ecosystem, and they basically told us what the missing data is, what they would like, and so on. So what I'm going to do now is talk about this kind of data assemblage genealogy of our data ecosystem. So this is how we're kind of starting to think through that collection of data sets. This is the case study I'm going to look at, which is the planning data ecosystem. So this is basically the planning system. There's normally 3 components of planning. So there's your strategic planning, your forward planning, your development pipeline, and then your enforcement and compliance. Do people build what they say they were going to build, and so on. I'm just going to focus on the development and control pipeline, which is basically providing data, or generating data, providing data around planning and around construction, about planning permissions and construction. We did interviews with 29 public sector officials from local authorities, different state agencies, and so on. We did walkthrough interviews of planning IT systems, so we got people to show us the IT system in action, show us them entering the data, processing the data, and so on. We also went through the IT manuals that went with the systems, and we reconstructed the data dictionaries for all of the systems. So basically what data is being generated by each system, and so on. And effectively what we were doing was charting the kind of the data assemblage, the data ecosystem, and the data mobilities within this. Now part of the reason why we're doing this, we're actually asked to do this by the governments, by local government management agency, because they didn't really know how this all fitted together, and they wanted to get a sense of it as to what IT systems are being used, what data is being collected, what data is being shared with who, how's this moving around, what's actually, with a view to then thinking about, well, how do we reform this and standardise this. So this is our notion of a data assemblage, if you're not familiar with the notion of a data assemblage. And effectively what we're doing is say for each IT system, what's it composed of in terms of its kind of object, if you like. So it's analog materials, its interfaces, its code, its databases, its hardware, its infrastructure, and so on. What are the kinds of conditions that shape that? So what, systems of thought, finance, political economies, governmentalities, legalities. What's the kind of things that shape how that system is built, how it's run, how it develops, and then who is doing it? So who are the agents that are involved in doing that? That's the extent at which I'm going to talk about data assemblies to a certain degree. I'll do a little bit later on. But this is just to give you a sense of how we're thinking about, we're seeing these as socio-technical systems, and we're as interested in the social as the technical. So this is the system pre-2000 in Ireland. If you were making a planning permission, you're going to build a house, or you're going to build a housing estate or whatever, what did you need to do, right? So we have put in a paper application, it goes into a local authority. We've only got really local authorities and Ombudsman. Ombudsman is the national planning appeals body. So if your permission's turned down, this is who you appeal to. Okay. We've only really got 2 types of organisation. You put in your paper application, it's processed by manually, it's all paper files, going to whatever. They'll do internal checks. 99%, they're doing email, so they'll send to other departments in the local authority, to the roads department, environment department, housing department. They say, have you got any objections to this planning permission? They'll also send it externally, so they'll send it off to Department of Environment, the Environment Protection Agency, and so on, and say, do you have any objections to this planning application? And then they make a decision. Now, if they refuse the decision, they could go up to planning appeals, and they could say, I want to appeal, and they make the grounds for appeal. Okay? Now, say they got permission, we go off down into building control, so they're now being permission to start their construction. When they start their construction, they have to give notice that they started There's a bunch of like checks that they've met the fire regulations, they've met safety regulations, whatever, you do building control, and then they do a completion cert to say they're finished. This is almost entirely a paper-based system, little bits, email, spreadsheets, whatever. This is pre-2000. And this is our notion of this kind of ecosystem as an assemblage of assemblages. So each part of this, the planning application, the appeal, the building control, they're all socio-technical systems, but they're interlinked. And they're sharing data and they're sharing information between each other to be able to make a decision as to whether somebody gets something to be built, and then did they build what they said they were going to build, does it meet standards, and so on. Okay. This is in 2004 now. We've started the process of digitalisation. So we've now got iPlan and APAS. These are digital management systems. These are planning management systems. They're basically document management systems. So the planning application, still paper application comes in, the planner enters the data into these IT systems. They're still doing the internal checks, so when the information comes back from email, it gets added into these systems. ePlan is a system whereby members of the public can object to a planning application. So they need to know what it is. So they basically put up PDFs of parts of the planning applications so the public could see them to know whether they wanted to object to them. If you wanted to object, you still have to write in a written letter. Okay, so still paper on the objection part. Okay, so they're processing building control on spreadsheets within each local authority. So it's still just local authorities with a little bit going on in terms of software agencies. LGCSB is the local government computer services board. For those local authorities who couldn't afford the proprietary software, the government built an alternative software system, which is iPlan. If we fast forward to 2017, we're still on paper applications. We have another IT system odyssey. There's 31 local authorities in Ireland, by the way. Okay, so 24 using iPlan, 5 using APAS, 2 using, and so on. There's a whole bunch of application types that can't be processed by these systems. They deal with them separately, using GIS or using spreadsheets or whatever. But there's a number of new systems and a number of new actors. So Mandelbaum have their own IT system management system. We have now national planning applications. This is done by the Department of Housing. So it's now going through from local through to national monitoring and pulling the data together. And we now have a national building control management system. So instead of every local authority doing it separately, it's all going into one central government database. And as a way of kind of illustrating that kind of assemblage of how that's put together, so the BCMS, Building Control Management System, was formulated in 2014. So it's introduced as an idea in 2014. And then this is the governance structure that's set up to put that system together, to kind of scope out what it should look like, work out this governance structure, work out what the IT needs were, work out what data should be collected, all this kind of stuff. Right? There's a whole bunch of different actors you can get from this side. It's not a straight. So this is an assemblage of different actors pulling together different knowledges, working within different frameworks, both private sector people at this table as well. Right? So all the developers, the builders, the architects, all have a say in this because they're who's get the data to be collected from. So they're seen as a vested interest who has an input. So there's a whole bunch of different things being pulled together to talk this through. And then there's a whole series of kind of timelines as to what needs to be developed and released at what different stages. Now, this gets muddled because the minister during this time keeps changing his mind and starts making exemptions. Okay, so they then have to keep going back into the software, rejigging around what the parameters are, rejigging around what's kind of needed, all this kind of stuff, right? So you get a sense of this is a messy process put together over 2 or 3 years as they put this thing in place. We're now in the process of this entire system being reviewed because it's seen as not being fit for purpose, okay, in terms of what was produced. Nearly all of our respondents talk about this being the dirtiest database that you have to deal with because it's effectively crowdsourced data. All the data entered into here is entered by the architects, the builders, the developers, and so on. And you can enter any, there's nothing, parameters stopping you entering. If you wanted to put in your car license plate as your planning permission number, you can do that. right? Like, there's all kinds of junk in this database, right? All types of ways in which people try to game the thing to be able to not pay development levies or pay them at a later date or to do different things in it. So they're in a process of doing a review around how you fix this database, which I'll come back up again when I talk about a company. This is in August 2023 when we're doing our field work. You've still got 12 local authorities out of 31 where you make your application on paper and the local authority digitises it, basically scans it and makes it into a PDF. Right? So you're still on paper. But one local authority has their own website, and then this is a kind of a portal, a national portal being put in place. We've got some new stuff going on at the government level as well. And you can see it's kind of getting more complicated as different things get bolted on and added on and kind of put together and so on. And it starts to get a little bit simpler now. A year later, that website's gone. We're down to 4 local authorities on paper. Everybody else has switched to this. This has increased, and nearly everybody is using ePlan now. I think everybody is using ePlan now. I think that's kind of where we're going. This has gone up from 17 to 21, and it's slowly starting to kind of get standardised a bit. And then this is the plan for 2027. So this is almost at the procurement stage now. It's been approved within government. And basically what will happen is every single local authority will be using exactly the same software, with exactly the same data standards, with exactly the same rule set, where none of them can locally configure it or go in and change things and do what they want with it. And it will be a kind of one system, which in theory will then produce national level data, because this does not produce harmonised data. It produces really messy data. Some of these systems work on lots of open free text fields, some of them work on drop-down menus, some of them are working on buttons, some of them are working... So the data, there's only about 21 fields that's shared, even though within IPAN you can enter in theory, APAS, I think, you can enter up to 1,300 variables in APAS if you were to fill it out all full and everything, right? There's only about 21 of those that's actually shared between IPAN and APAS. And those 21 don't actually match either, in terms of like the format used or the standard used or whatever else might be in it. So this is designed to fix that. Okay, so this is probably just about to go up to procurement relatively soon, I think. So you can kind of get the sense of here, this kind of relatively simple paper base, starting to go digitalisation, starting to get more and more complicated, and then starting to pull back into being, so basically as standardisation comes back in, and they try to rationalise what's going on. And this is all about trying to create national level data sets that you can compare what the heck is going on. Like a lot of countries, we have a big housing planning crisis, and it's very difficult to get a handle on what's happening. So this is designed to try and get a handle on what's going on. I'm going to talk about data mobilities here, because one of the things you probably notice is there's lots of arrows on here of bits of data being passed around, samples of data being passed around within this. So central to the construction and operation of these data ecosystems are data mobilities, okay, the movement of data within these. So what that enables basically is data mobility effectively enable a data lifecycle to happen, data enrichment, data fusion to happen, sharing, reuse, repurposing, new data products, new services. Each of these bits is reliant on knowing something about somewhere else, right? Some data has got to pass, some information has got to pass through this. And what we've tried to do was map this out in detail. This is partly what we were commissioned to do, was to work out what data is actually kind of shifting around in the system. So this is our attempt to map out what's happening at the plan and application stage. Now there is a bit of a timeline on here. So they have to get this done within 12 weeks. So there's all these requests going off to other sections of the department, off to third parties to get feedback and data back in again, for them to do their processing of the data and try to work out whether they're going to give planning permission, they're going to give planning permission, what the planning conditions, and so on. Okay. They also have to go and check off whether they paid the money and whether they paid their plan and application fees. So has to go off and check off these financial databases. So there's a whole bunch of these kind of data flows going on for them to be able to make a decision at the end. This is what happens then when it goes off into planning appeals. It's a similar kind of diagram where we're just trying to work out what data came in. So some data came in from the local authority, they passed on some of the files and so on. The original applicant might have also passed in some new data, and then it's all kind of processed and they make a decision at the end of it. This is what it looks like a building control. And part of what's going on here is a whole series of, again, it's on a timeline where different kinds of certs have got to come in. So building control certs, fire safety certs, whatever, it's got to come in at different points. And you have your commencements, and basically you get to the end of you submitting your completion cert saying this building is now completed and is ready for occupation. Okay. Now some of that data flows out the bottom. Actually, very little of that data flows out the bottom in terms of official statistics. So we kind of talked about the kind of 1,300 variables in APAS. 14 of those variables end up in official statistics in the Central Statistics Office. It's a relatively small number of variables pop out the bottom. So some of the data is going into the CSO, some of it's going into the National Open Data Portal, some of it's going off into the Housing Agency Data Hub, some of it's going off into the Department of Housing's annual statistics kind of public publications. This kind of towards the bottom tier here. And then some of it's going off into these kind of tracking analytics kinds of systems. So these are basically taking the data and making them into graphs and maps and charts and so on. Now, since we've done this link no longer works. This website's gone defunct. These are not necessarily stable systems that are around for a long period of time. They often disappear. The same thing for this actually. In our big spreadsheet that I had before, there are very, very few data sets that go back pre-2010, pre-2001. The longitudinal runs on them are actually really short. They're not going back into the 70s or the 1940s or whatever. A lot of them are really short. A lot of these stuff. So this is this company I was talking about before who really trade on this BCMS system. So what they do is they go onto the e-plan websites of every local authority every day and scrape out all the data. Actually, they don't do it. A company in India who's subcontracted to do it does it. Okay? They scrape out all the data, they clean it up, they sort it out, and then they pass it back, right? And they basically have all the data for the country at individual property level, all cleaned and validated. In fact, the validation team in this company is by far the biggest team. They literally bring up the architects and the builders and the planning consultants and say, is this correct? Can I run through your application and make sure this is true? Okay? Because they're selling it on, and who they're selling it on to demands that it's accurate data. So validation is a key part of the thing. And a key part of their job is to take that dirty database of the BCMS, and they don't want the BCMS corrected. Because this is their business model. Their business model is to scrape the state data, clean it up, add value to it, and then sell it on. And of course, part of who they're selling it on is back to the state. Okay, so the state's got this dirty data. Now buying back the data that's been scraped from them back so they can use it themselves. So that's some of the value that's on this private. So this kind of private-public kind of partnership relationship is partly what's kind of going on. Now that's what's interesting in the notion of data mobility. So in each one of these projects, what we're trying to do is take these concepts, like assemblage, ecosystem, data mobility, and use them to think through the material. We're also trying to use them to rethink those concepts. And data mobility is definitely one we think needs to be rethought. Okay, so we have this notion that there are, data. Most talk around mobility data talks about is using metaphors of movement, so kind of liquids or goods. So you've got data flow, streams, pipelines, journeys, threads, transfers, exchanges, blah blah blah. Right? Okay. And in a sense, it moves from here to there, and it transforms as it moves, right? So the data makes a journey, kind of goes along this journey, okay? Now, we think that that's nonsense. That's not how data moves at all, right? Data doesn't move like a liquid or a good. It replicates. When an open data site shares its data with you, it still retains the data. It doesn't leave the open data and move to you. It gets replicated as it goes along, right? So it replicates, and it also proliferates. And it's also transforming. So we've been trying to work through this new kind of theory around this. But one of the issues around this is you end up with multiple incarnations of the original source data. Okay. So this is this kind of what's kind of happening. So instead of this kind of data journey, we have data replicating and it being transformed. There's multiple versions of the same data set. And a way of thinking about this is just to go back through that system. So if the data coming in from the applicants, it's getting entered into iPlan, it's getting transformed in that. Now, a subset of this is going into ePlan, a subset of this is going into NPAD, the National Plan Application Database. So these are subsets rather than transformations. But at this point, the company is scraping out all the data and proliferating. Because I can now go and get this company's data and I can transform that. I can do my own work on that, make it into my own statistics, my own products and so on. Once it comes through into, back into iPlan here, goes off to appeals, more data comes back. And we have proliferation going on the open data side, we have proliferation going on the BCMS. BCMS is an open database, anybody in the room here can download BCMS. Okay. So proliferation, so you end up potentially with multiple versions of the same source data. And that raises all kinds of issues around evidence base. As soon as it comes to proliferate and transformation, we can all have different data versions of the same original data set, which means we can probably come up with different analysis and different conclusions. So this is why you get problems around repeatability, replicability and reproducibility in science. Okay? Is because the data gets kind of transformed in different ways. It raises all kinds of questions, I think, around data sovereignty and control around data sets. Once it proliferates, once it starts to circulate, you have control over it. Interestingly indeed, you have control over this. This is where you lose control of these proliferation points. The rest of it is quite controlled because the data stays internal to the system. It's only at those points where it escapes. Okay, so what I'll try to do quite quickly is just to kind of show how we're kind of thinking about trying to chart the unfolding continuum, continuum process of digitalisation. So we try to do that over like a 25-year arc. These systems don't appear overnight. They come in over really long periods of time. You get different inflection points. You know, so nothing really happened between kind of 2006, 2007, and 2014 because there was a massive housing crisis, massive financial crisis, huge state crisis in Ireland, massive reduction of planning staff, so kind of 35% reduction in planning staff, huge reduction in planning budgets, and also very few planning applications. And it's only when it starts to recover that they start to go, okay, planning was part of the problem going into the crisis. We need to fix this. So you get the BCMS being done, you get these new planning IT systems coming in, and so on. I'm aware of my time, so I'll just stop. You can read the rest of the conclusion yourself, basically. Okay?
Fantastic.
Oh yeah, great. So everyone, please get ready for session 3, which is on digital mapping, data assemblages, and regional governance. The first presentation is by Tom Cowan from the University of Nottingham. And I think we can start, Tom.
Yeah, here. Do you want me to tell you?
No, I'm not.
Okay, thanks so much. So today I'm going to present research. Can I shout?
Sure.
Can I shout? Can people hear me? Okay, so I'm going to present research on a project I've been doing over the past couple of years that explores the social technical politics of large-scale land and property digitalisation schemes in India. My presentation today is going to look particularly at the politics that's involved, the sort of implement that's incurred in the process of digital enclosure. But before I do that, I'll give a kind of overview of some of the research questions and what the project looks like. So my research is principally focused on an ethnographic study of the government of India's flagship property digitalisation schemes called Swamitra, it's kind of old Sanskrit word meaning ownership. The scheme was launched in 2020 by the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and principally aims to mobilise a network of drone, continuously operating reference system technology, geospatial platform technology to enclose and assetize rural collectivised territories called Abadis. Around 600,000 of them across the country. Abadis are the residential part of a rural or urban village. They are owned under a collective title, they are unmapped, and over the past 20 years we've seen this mass expansion of urban real estate, peri-urban real estate development. They've been viewed as these kind of opaque obstacles to large-scale sort of expanded urbanisation. So the scheme has two core aims. One is to utilise these new technologies to annul the collective right to land and generate around 200 million private property parcels that residents can then leverage as assets on financial markets. So according to government officials, this process of land enclosure will unleash some $2 trillion of land value for rural and peri-urban residents. And this of course draws on this age-old neoliberal doctrine that that private ownership, financial market inclusion, property citizenship will unleash a property mode of socio-economic development. It also positions the scheme as a kind of putatively pro-poor program, right, delivering ownership rights to rural residents who otherwise experience quite an even sense of growing stress. The second aim of the scheme is to create a central platform that can essentially bypass local institutions and the local rural state and provide a platform for higher level state officials, investors, developers to see into and govern and know previously opaque rural and peri-urban territories. It's also a platform where geospatial property data can be mobilised across India's new gargantuan digital public infrastructure. And for scheme officials and industry figures involved in the scheme, the technology that the scheme uses offers a really powerful social neutrality and also visual objectivity that can bypass these sticky local institutions that are getting in the way of both rural development but also in a kind of functioning land market. And there's of course a core tension between the idea, the kind of explicitly stated ambition in the scheme to transform customary rural property rights. It's a transformative scheme, but also in the ambition to use technology to produce a clip for technical clarification. We're just able to use technology to see land and territory more clearly, and that's a tension that I'll speak to in a moment. So the questions that I've been exploring in my research are first, quite simply, how are new digital property technologies enclosing land? What are the social technical practices and imaginaries required to transform 600,000 collective titles into 200 million privately owned parcels? And I've been kind of pursuing that question through an ethnography where I follow drone surveyors, so that survey officials, data engineers, as they implement the scheme through its various phases. I'll talk about in a second. The second question is around how this process is impacting social relations. An open-ended question I won't speak to today. And finally, how is the data produced under the scheme being incorporated and circulated through a new series of public infrastructures that are informal in a range of public services beyond land and property management itself. So, for example, public welfare. Put it in the order, but my projects look at 3 states, 9 villages, and mostly been ethnographic. Just to give you a very, very quick sense of how the scheme works and what my research has looked like, in order to map unmapped Abadi territories, first an outer boundary of the village is demarcated in chalk, then a drone survey is taken and images taken of the territory. These images are sent away to a computer engineer who just look at the image and draw property parcels on what they perceive to be possession rights. These are then sent back to the villages where ownership details are assigned to each and every property parcel, and then they're finalised and property cards are distributed. For our purposes, it's important to note that the first 3 phases of the scheme involve no local arbitrary at all. Right? It could happen without even a village knowing that a drone has been blown and maps been sent away. It's only in the latter stages that people are involved in determining what counts as a property claim and what doesn't. As there are no existing legal rights or internal property boundaries on these lands, when these computer engineers map property parcels, they do so based not on legal records, but on their perception of what a possession claim looks like on the map. So they look for boundary walls, they look for roofs, built-up areas, and they ascribe to these areas individual ownership rights. In doing so, the scheme produces what I think of as an entirely new visual calculus to property. One able to extract individual ownership from undivided lands, speculatively map plots, and cleanly link property to global asset markets. This visual calculus requires residents to express their claims in visual terms, and requires engineers to seek out those visual forms on the map. And as the scheme now is being trained, a kind of AI/ML feature extraction model is being trained on the existing data, this kind of visual politics of claim making is feeding into the AI/ML tool that's being developed. And I'll speak to the politics of that in a moment. Even though this data is quite incomplete, it's already being implemented within a range of public digital infrastructures and governance tools across the country. There are lots of examples of this in India today. In my research, I focused on a family identification program in Haryana called Kitchin that uses land and property data generated under the scheme to determine families' access to state welfare. But what I found in doing the research is that the equation that they're using with the land and property data is really rudimentary, right? It's either it's basically the square meterage of the land plus whether it's rural or urban that will give them a value to determine whether a resident has access or not to public welfare. So increasingly I've been trying to think about the politics that's incurred in this kind of deeply social and aesthetic mode of property making under Swamippa. And rather think in terms of kind of outright opposition to the scheme, I'm interested in the quieter, mediative politics through which are disrupting and reconfiguring enclosure processes under the scheme, and I do so drawing on feminist geographers' work on the glitch. In considering glitch politics, I'm interested in the mediative quality of enclosure, how that mediation, that requirement for a computer engineer to perceive private property, for locals in villages to kind of buy into the program, generates fissures and irregularities. I'll just highlight 2 before I finish. The first is what I think of as an alignment glitch. As I've discussed, because the scheme relies purely on a visual register, it's actually led to residents, in anticipation of the drone, laying out their claims in visual terms. So it doesn't really matter what your historic claim or use of the land is. If you can pitch chalk boundary or you can set some stones out, then you can make a claim to the land. What this has meant is a huge encroachment on open public land within these villages that tends to be used by scheduled house communities within these territories. This has also disrupted the state, kind of encroached on a huge amount of state land. And one of the ambitions of the scheme was to produce a whole repertoire of data on state lands across the country. But because of this visual register, this is not only has led to a huge number of legal contestations over the process, but also radically diminished the amount of state land that's available, and led to some states have completely withdrawn from the scheme because of this. Others have had to expand the territory. The second glitch as such is in the assignment phase, so when the maps return to the villages, ownership details have to be assigned, but in many cases, villagers have refused to assign an ownership quality to the parcel and have sought to smuggle in customary claims into the digital registry. because the registry only accepts private or state land, this has meant there's huge gaps and blanks and asterisks in the data. This has caused huge amounts of backlog as the data is fed into public infrastructure because the coverage of the data is so low that it can't be really used any longer. So I'll wrap up there. And you can ask questions in the Q&A.
The next, Oren, Rani, and Fahima, if you could come up to present.
We can't fly like a drone. Hi everybody, I'm Oren and Rani Mandelbaum, my partner, and Fahima Atawnah, research is on the group and it's on the program. We want to present to you our preliminary results of a project that's going on for 3 years. And to some extent it's in parallel to the project of Atawnah and all her great colleagues, assessing, analyzing the impact of digitalization on urban citizenship. And we have an international aspect, and we have also an aspect in Israel-Palestine, comparing 3 cities. We titled this Digitize and Divide. Alexander the Great would excuse us. But the connotation is there, stratified citizenship. I start by every lecture in the last 2 years, I start this with we're actually experiencing a total disaster currently on our land in Gaza. There's a genocide going on. There's destruction, there's crumbling of human society in front of our eyes. Something unbelievable is actually happening. I think everybody around the world should do anything they can to stop it. And so far, people doing very little. So, must remind that. And also it's very much a geographical and it's a planning disaster. It's total destruction. You will see that in the lecture too. Rani and I worked in the past over 10 years. She's now at Hebrew University, but she was in Peripheral in the past. And we wrote a few articles about social justice in the city. And this is 2 of my recent publications. This one was launched by Nancy Oldendale in Cape Town a year and a half ago. And this one was a city. And I put this here. It's a little bit of a self-advertisement, but also these 2 books reflect the tension with which we deal theoretically and conceptually. Because we did this special issue, Thrown Togetherness, which was 20 years after Doreen Massey did her work, which is a multicultural, sort of soft understanding, critical but liberal of the democratic city, and theorized in the global southeast is dealing with much harsher regimes, with much darker transformation of reality. And this is the tension about digitalization, with actually the global system that Bill Gates famously promised to us. This is the new urban square of the digital world. What Zuckerberg said, we're going to connect everybody around the world. It's going to be one global community. The efficiency, the speed, the globalization, the unity, the homogenization, the promise of the digital revolution is actually hitting the ground in the vast majority of the world, which is not the global north and west, which is only about 20% of the world. In the 80% of the world, and many of them in conflict area, in conflict zone. And Ellen Elster is sitting here from LSE, and we're on a project of digitalization in conflict zone. So we must keep that apart. When the digital revolution is hitting the ground, it's doing it in a very, very different ways. And to assess how we do that, we came up with this proposed methodology, epistemology, to actually break it into what we call deep impact. With those kind of categories that you all know, but we delve deeper into them in data and surveillance, infrastructure, economic social, political. Each one of them claim there is a massive transformation of human society, and we can discuss it, how it affects from above and from below. It's mostly from above in our research. It's very little that can be done from below, but there are some. And also the impact over time, whether it creates greater equality, as we saw in Rwanda, that was very inspiring, right? Or divided society, or even apartheid. And our claim so far, after a year and a half of work, is that in Beersheba region, and we have different metropolitan regions, very interesting, in the city itself, which is a more modern cyber center of Israel, high-tech society, is still a democratic city, but it creates great division. But in the metropolis, which is surrounded by indigenous Bedouin and Palestinian people, it creates an apartheid system, which amplifies an already existing very racist system. It amplifies it and accelerates the process of apartheidization. So these are the three cities that we, in this project, we compare. Tel Aviv is globalizing, democratic and liberal. Jerusalem is a colonial city with occupation. Beersheba is creating apartheid. And I give the stage to Rani that will talk about Beersheba.
So, I will go about everything quite quickly, but the thing we need to understand about Beersheba, the capital of the Negev Desert, is that it's relatively small, relatively Jewish, and the inner center, let's say the inner city, is have much more, let's call it, people of lower social-economic status in comparison to the surrounding neighborhoods. And the whole process of the digital transformation is very, very top-down. It started in about 10 years ago when the government declared Beersheba as the digital city and made her kind of the pilot city to all kind of digital projects within Israeli cities in general. It continued with not the establishment, but it's the declaration of Beersheba Innovation District. And today, actually, the whole very famous department of innovation is less than 10 job positions, and let's call it not a very big budget, but still everything happens mostly top down. When we are looking at the digital services offered to the residents of the city, yes, not the metropolis, the city. And it's very important because many times you actually need to enter your ID and everything. We have a lot of systems, we have a lot of services given online. However, as we analyze the budget itself, we see that actually most of the resources are given to the inner system, meaning system that manage the HR, the finance, and not necessarily the systems helping the public in a more of direct way. Looking at the system themselves, the services, it's very easy to notice that all of them, the inner system as well as the public-oriented, are offered by exactly the same private company. And this private company is not only giving services to Beersheba, actually it's giving services to about half of the 250 municipalities in Israel, talking about a small market, yeah. So, and it's not only that, it's, as we know, it's giving the services and collecting all the information, right? Because we will talk about it in a minute. As Oren started to mention, Beersheba shows a kind of, let's call it, classic digital divide. For example, 25% of the population in Beersheba does not speak Hebrew as a first language. Yet, all the services are offered only in Hebrew. Okay? We have a lot of elderly, etc. But if to be fair, I will say that the Beersheba municipality still offering all kind of services and all given also through more traditional kind of way, like through phone or personal meetings. So this is something, and as they say, they kept some of the accessibility through that. They're also offering, again, from the top down, a pretty good accessibility to all kind of information, even though in many cases you actually need to have a lot of knowledge and a lot of skills in order to actually use all of the information that is online. Almost 4,000 cameras around the city. I guess you all know the trick. It's all like of the city, but it's managed by, again, a very private, big private company. And maybe one last word about the Innovation District. Yeah, and the Innovation District is, as you might imagine, it's the most powerful institutions in the area, but the, let's say, social or technological contribution to the city is very minimal. However, they do promote a very old-fashioned kind of gentrification in the residential area.
So we'll take maybe one extra minute to talk about the metropolis. So when you go outside of Beersheba, this is the Beersheba city, and this is the metropolitan plan. But all these indigenous people don't appear on the plan. There's hundreds of thousands of Bedouins, and this is part of the Apartheid that is written. You know, this is the provision of infrastructure, of optic fiber cables, and you see all the empty areas. There are different degrees. All the empty areas that are actually without any service, with many people off the net. And in interviews they're telling us that it sounds very romantic to be below the radar and off the net, but it's very, very difficult to have no digital citizenship. We actually did quite a detailed survey about the accessibility to the net in different regions or in different parts of the metropolitan region. These are the outer ring of Beersheba, the more middle class, upper middle class. For example, broadband cables, 94%, the inner city, 84%. So this is a divided city with class, ethno-class differences. But when you go outside the city to the metropolis, which is very much typical of the global south and east, you have in some towns 60%, in some villages that are on the map but don't have facilities 21%, you have 0% of accessibility to broadband among hundreds of thousands of people, right? And when you go to all the other detail, we don't have enough time, we see this kind of graduated, stratified citizenship, which is caused or amplified by the digitalization process. And I see that Neha is telling us the time is finished. One more slide about house demolition, which is very important. We talk conflict zone, we talk high violence, that hasn't been mentioned here. In many regions around the world, digitalization and control from above is associated with high violence of the state or other actors. In the last year, they had 5,321 demolition, which is unprecedented. It's about 10 times from the rest of the country. And I'll finish with a quote of Atawnah El-Assam, who is the head of the Indigenous Association. Said our localities are on a major battle to survive. We lack almost all infrastructure, but one of the worst is the lack of digital infrastructure. Without it, we face more and more uncrossable boundaries, never experienced by Jews who live in a digital apartheid. So we have to take this consideration when we think about digital society. Thank you.
Thank you, Oren and Rani. Next, we have Smith Ouma from the University of Manchester.
Are you over there?
Yeah. Are you good?
Great, thank you very much. So I'll be speaking on these two informal settlements, and I'll be speaking to project or sort of assemblage that has been trialed in these two informal settlements, which I sort of view as sort of a digital ruin, something that was trialed in these two informal settlements with different kinds of outcomes. And this presentation today is part of a larger project that I'm involved in together with social movements in Nairobi, Kenya. And it is in an informal settlement where residents, through their social movements, are trying to harness land data to secure their claims within this informal settlement. And they are working on different types of assemblages, different types of data-making practices to try to secure these claims within these spaces where they've been peripheralized, within these spaces where we have these informational asymmetries. So these data-making practices by these residents, through, of course, through their social movements, have sprung from the fact that these residents view themselves as excluded from the dominant data-making practices by the state. We've heard a bit about how the state in Kenya is constituting land data infrastructure, but this often happens in many contexts to the exclusion of low-income urban residents. So residents, through their social movements and other actors like civil society organizations, have put in place these alternative systems of land data making that they use to try to expand their claims to the land that they occupy. So this also comes from a realization that these data infrastructures and systems that have been put in place are exclusionary. The state puts in place these land information systems as a tool for resource control and expanding its control of territory. So in its attempts to expand its territorial reach, the state creates these infrastructures which it devises as a tool for resource control and for asserting its authority over space. And these processes have also been described by Atawnah as a process of digitalisation, as urbanization, through which the state extracts new territories, especially in spaces where it feels like its control and authority is weak, like informal settlements, where oftentimes residents occupy land without permission from the state or without permission from the private owners of these parcels of land. And the outcomes of these data-making practices by the state is that peripheralization, not only physical peripheralization, but also digital peripheralization of residents of these informal settlements. But these settlements are also sites of experimentation by different actors, particularly civil society organizations, who draw on their extensive reach, both locally and also internationally, to bring on board tools and practices that residents in these spaces can use to now build this data they can use to advance their different courses. So we've seen a rise of different types of data-making practices, which in this paper we align with the assemblages discourse, and these assemblages are put in place to challenge these exclusions that occur. But still, with the interventions that have been proposed for these informal settlements, we still see that a lot of them are approached as, from a very technical point of view. They do not adequately account for the politics within these settlements and also for the everyday practices by residents in these settlements. So we sought to look at this experiment that was tried in these two informal settlements and to try to unpack the politics behind it, to try to look at the actors who drove this intervention in these two informal settlements, the ideologies that they brought in place, and also how this experiment was experienced by the residents themselves, and the kinds of politics that features during this experimentation. So this is one of the informal settlements. Mandara informal settlement located in Nairobi. So this is a map that we recently produced. And these boundaries that you see here are representative of the different villages within this broad settlement. So there's 13 villages in these settlements. And these are shape files that we produced, which sort of depict the structures on these different parcels, on these different villages. And this is just zooming into one of the settlements where we see the boundaries. You know, there's been a lot of talk around boundaries. We see these lines that have been drawn by the state representing the different parcels of land. But on top of this, we have the structures themselves, structures that have been established by low-income residents. So oftentimes when you look at the state land data infrastructures, we find all this information. We find these land reference numbers, we find these boundaries. But what is often not accounted for is these kinds of establishments, you know, housing structures within these settlements. Who owns these structures? Where do they get permission to construct these structures? How do they deal with the different interests, competing interests that emerge from these kinds of establishments? So for instance, this is one parcel of land. So if you go to the government registries, you'll find that there's one person who is the registered proprietor of this one parcel of land. But the fact on the ground is that there's going to be multiple plots, multiple housing structures, and the paper ownership oftentimes do not correspond with the actual ownership of space on the ground. So when you look at these state-based land data systems, they will not account for these facts on the ground. And oftentimes you see also that, you know, we have boundaries, but we have entitlements that stretch beyond these boundaries. So we're trying to look at, you know, beyond the state-held land data infrastructure, what other interests subsist on these parcels of land, and how are they represented within these parcels of land. So something was tried in terms of trying to account for those interests, and this is one of the settlements that that experiment or that intervention was tried. The other settlement is a settlement that is located in Kenya's second largest city, that is Mombasa, and the parcels of land here are primarily privately held. So we try to understand this intervention in the form of the social tenure domain model. Who were the drivers of these interventions, and what logics, what property logics were they trying to drive, and what was the outcome of this intervention? But before that, these are some of the features that we see in these two settlements, that, you know, there are competing and overlapping interests in land. That there will be a person with a paper title, but there will be other people with, you know, an interest in the structure that has been established there. There will be another person with an interest in the pipes that are constructed to reticulate water, electric lines. So there's all this overlapping and competing interests, which oftentimes are not accounted for. And also, even within this context, there's different protections that the law and the state accords to the different interests, that oftentimes the individuals with the paper title are accorded the biggest form of protection by the state. But residents in these settlements try to expand or thicken their claims to land and thicken their claims to space. But in doing this, they experience different barriers, including the costs of accessing land information. So we know of the high costs of accessing land information, so that sometimes they'll try to claim this land through adverse possession, but the evidentiary proof that they have to overcome is very big because they can't access this data. So these are some of the features that we see in these informal settlements. So this intervention was tried. It's an intervention, it's a land administration model in the name of the social tenure domain model. And it is a tool that was developed by the UN Habitat through partners under the Global Land Tools Network. And it is an intervention that sought to account for these other interests beyond ownership. So it tried to capture informal interests in land and also customary interests in land. So these are some of the actors that are involved in GLTN. We see different civil society organizations, both domestic and international. And these different actors bring in different data rationalities and property logics. So when a tool like SDDM is experimented in an informal settlement, you already have these actors who have different views to what property needs to look like and what data rationalities should be adopted in these kinds of spaces. So we try to look at the actors themselves and the property logics that they try to drive in these two settlements. And then they bring this tool to these two informal settlements, and this is when the imaginary meets the reality. And the imaginary here was that, first of all, SDDM as a tool was envisioned as a tool that could now be used by low-income residents to collectively hold land. So an idea was proposed that this is a tool that can be used to provide communal ownership of land for residents. And it was also envisioned as a tool that could bring in more recognition from the state to the residents of these two informal settlements. And an outcome of this was that residents will be issued a certificate of ownership, of occupancy, that they could now use as proof of their entitlement to land within these spaces. The tool was also brought in at a time when the country was experiencing going through a legal transition, and a Community Land Act had been adopted, which now took account of different other forms of tenure typologies. So it was sort of an intervention that was trying to test the limits of the Community Land Act. But then the imaginary meets the reality in these two settlements, and we start to see different approaches by the county government in Nairobi, in one of the places, and the county government in Mombasa, adopting different views to this kind of intervention. So I know my time is up. And the idea was that in Nairobi, this experiment failed, while in Mombasa, an outcome was that residents were issued with a certificate of occupancy. And this also was informed by the levels of support that the county government in both contexts extended to this kind of intervention. So this is Mombasa, where see the county government participating in issuing a resident with, sorry, I'm going to stop there.
Sorry about that, but we have to give, yeah.
Sorry, just to jump to the conclusion. So here we're trying to ask ourselves, how can these tools be embedded more in, communities and within the social movements within this community to ensure that we avoid the sort of pitfalls that we saw in these two settlements. And this informs the ongoing move by these social movements, particularly in Mathare, to construct this alternative land information system and to embed it more within the structures, within these social movements, because they see that as a tool to insulate these kinds of interventions from the pitfalls that they saw when the social tenure domain model was experimented by those external actors. Sorry, I hope we'll have room to chat more about this during the Q&A session, but thank you.
Next we have Lalita Kraus from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I feel really privileged to be here with you today, so thank you. My name is Lalita Kraus. I'm professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in the Department of Regional and Urban Planning. And today I'm presenting to you the research I'm doing together with Taina Faria, she's here, and Gilberto Vieira. So we are a research group. We are working on urban technopolitics and social spatial justice. And our work is guided by a socially engaged approach that fosters a non-extractive relationship with the communities involved. So basically, we work together. And in our group, there are like academics, professors, researchers, and also social activists, as Gilberto Vieira. And today, we are presenting a little bit what we define as urban data politics. We identify in Rio de Janeiro 2 different contentious data agendas, revealing different ways in which set of data represent the city and govern its territories. So on one side, we can see an institutional politics of data, and on the other side, a contentious, disputed politics of data. And our focus is on the political nature of data, especially from a technopolitical perspective, which implies that the artifacts, like technologies and data, have politics. So they simultaneously enable political action, at the same time are shaped by political strategy. So today we briefly present how data power transforms, in our view, the idea of such a social justice. We work with Nancy Fraser's definition of social justice. We work with the concept of data justice, trying to introduce a little bit a spatial perspective. And so when we think about Rio de Janeiro, just to give you a quick background, the emphasis on data-driven and the massive investment in digital infrastructure were heavily shaped by the global agenda, specifically the smart city agenda and the mega events like the Olympic Games and the World Cup. And to us, these events, for example, Rio de Janeiro undertook a digitalization process in which data, in our view, were framed as a strategic assets to improve efficiency, delivering results, and enforcing discipline. So this approach was embodied in the 3 main pillars of the data-driven urban governance: the Operational Center, the Command and Control Center for Public Security, and the 1746, which is basically the Brazilian equivalent of the American 311. So our past studies reveal that this scenario produced a scenario in which urban data power follows the same rationale as the urban planning and urban governance in Rio de Janeiro, sustaining, but I will say also exacerbating, historical power asymmetries, negatively affecting peripheral population and communities, while at the same time they are projecting this idea of an efficient and operational city. But in our view, this is changing a little bit, because we observe at the same time the emergence of grassroots initiatives that subvert, rearrange, and reappropriate data practices to claim rights and recognition in Brazil by promoting a citizen-generated data agenda. The name refers to a global agenda sponsored by the UN, but in this case, in Rio de Janeiro, the way in which the agenda lands is appropriated and resignified in Rio de Janeiro reveal what we define a tropicalization for social justice. So the agenda, as you can see here, reached the peripheral territories of Rio de Janeiro through a UN-affiliated organization called Civicus, and they financed in the favela of Maré a project organized by the organization Data Lab, and the project was called Cocozapi, which means literally the blend of 2 words, Coco, which is poo, and WhatsApp. So through a dedicated WhatsApp number and local mobilization, the residents of this big complex of favela can send complaints, so video, messages, and pictures about sanitation issues in the neighborhoods. And these information are then georeferenced and complement, or I would say they challenge the so-called official governmental data. So the project was so successful, then it led to the articulation of peripheral activists in all the city that ended up in the foundation of the Citizen-Generated Data Network in 2023. The nectar aimed at defending and mobilizing data produced by the peripheral communities for counter-data action, counter-mapping, and the building of their own metrics. And the nectar unites diverse organizations. Here in the map we have just some of them. And they are actively involved in rural and also rural peripheries across different sectors, such as urban mobility, basic sanitation, climate change, and public security. And while some organizations leverage existing communication infrastructure, others develop autonomous digital alternatives. And the unifying element of the nectar is a shared tactical methodology for citizen-generated data, which is structured around 7 steps. So basically they identify the problem with the community, so it's the community showing what's the problem. It's a totally bottom-up process. They discuss the limitation from a methodology point of view in order to guarantee validity to the methodology. They select which data sources exist and what they need to produce and show. They engage people and communities in all the phases, in all the steps. They structure all the methodology of the data collection, and they communicate to a broad public all the results. And so in our analysis, we are thinking about how this data activism transforms the idea of social justice. And we observed that the network defines its grammar of justice, revealing new explications for exclusions and how it should be understood and resolved through data. It reveals an ontology of justice where data are strategic for multiple dimensions. The first one is misdistribution. So the data of the network reveal an even distribution of services, of resources, of public policies. And as shown in the COCOSAP map, you can see all the green points indicate locations with water and sewage problems. They are not captured by the so-called official data and statistics. But I will say that what is more important for the nectar is the dimension of misrecognition, because the data ensure, on one side, the recognition and visibility of the peripheral reality, but also will say that data also guarantee the recognition of social diversities, because the metrics they produce are differentiated by gender, race, and class, for example. So they want to show that social phenomena affect different groups in a different way. And the last point is the misrepresentation. So data promotes a power-sharing arrangement in some cases, because when the data produced and the knowledge produced are incorporated into legal and planning instruments. In some cases, it happens. So the citizen-generated data operate across all these 3 dimensions. And so in relation to the subjects, the nectar enhances subjects' capacity to assert their rights and reduces alienation from datification arms. So, first of all, the nectar is a really important political stance, which is the fostering of popular protagonism. So, by involving mainly people from the peripheries and working with representatives of marginalized groups. Because this is a political strategy, especially for one reason, because they say that data and policies must be informed by the knowledge and experience of people living the local reality. And when we talk about participation and agency, they are also fostered by engaging the population in every stage, in every step of the methodology. So from data production to data analysis. So they are strengthening their data literacy and analytical capacity. So this really starts an empowerment process for the local population. In terms of scales, which is really important in our analysis, the scale chosen for the justice claim is local. So the nectar adopts a localist perspective with the periphery as the unit of claiming. So the territory is both the starting point and the end point of the proposed methodology. So they work with small and territorialized data. So rather than focusing on big data, the citizen-generated data emphasizes micro-scale, localized, and intentional uses of data, not extractive. And it's not only related to improving granularity and overcoming imprecision. So what the network, what the representatives say is that they also challenge the erasure of inequality inherent in the logic of the averages. See, certain phenomena can only be explained through disaggregated data, like, for example, the incidence of police violence on black people. And it thus serves as a tool for situated counter-narratives that challenge the coloniality of power and knowledge exercised, for example, by governmental agencies. And the last point is the idea that situatedness in the periphery is an intentional political strategy. So they don't want to necessarily scale up, that's what they say. The methodology is designed to be replicable through horizontal scale up across peripheral territories. And since I don't have much time, so to wrap it up, so how they make claims effective. They do training, mobilization, the data strength they're claiming because they use metrics to do that. And then also they try to make the claim effective, trying to include it in legal and planning instrument. But this is not the main objective of the network. So just to conclude a little bit, and the network offers a counter-narrative to the dominant agenda of the innovative data-driven city. So it's a diverse data world. They promote a tropical grammar of justice, and it depends on the the history of local activism in Rio de Janeiro. They re-signify a global agenda for social justice. They promote a just data technopolitics, reflecting a long history of technological innovation in Latin America, and they focus mainly on agency and autonomy. So now we want to see if they really are able to promote structural change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lalita. Our final presentation for the panel is by Carla Maria Kayanan. I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. No? Great, thank you. She's from the University of Maynooth.
Working on Rob's Data Stories project. And I'm going to bring us then back to Ireland to talk about data, evidence-based policy, and forward planning. The argument that I'm going to make is that new territorial agendas, regional and metropolitan, are made possible because of a digital information infrastructure. And I'm going to argue that through this tool through a policy called the Housing Need and Demand Assessment, and particularly an Excel tool that I'm going to show you. Now, it is an Excel tool, so it's not necessarily a sophisticated type of technology, but it still operates on the same type of calculative logic that help to define territory. It is used by the 31 local authorities in Ireland to determine their long-term housing need. And I'm going to talk about 3 points. The first is the discrepancies in the data that are underpinning the policy. Then I'm going to draw connections between the consultants as para-state actors. And finally, I'm going to talk about how the tool doesn't mirror ground realities. By way of the literature, there's a lot here to say, and in this short time, I'm just going to fly through this, but mostly that the focus on evidence-based planning is aided, as well as the rise of consultants as para-state actors, are aided by these types of digital information infrastructures informed by the digital turn as well as the infrastructural turn. The material flows in particular, as I will discuss when I talk about this tool, is about population projections, where the population is being siphoned and how housing construction is going to support these population projections. I'm going to be pulling from 2 different projects. The first is a postdoctoral research project I had called Achieving Regional Equality, where I worked with Ireland's Southern Regional Assembly, and I toured that part to talk to the local authority councillors about how they felt about these different types of policy arrangements. And then Data Stories, which is Rob Kitchin's ERC project, and a particular case on the housing need and demand assessment. Multiple interviews with HNDA stakeholders, workshops, because we are engaging creative methodologies to try to understand how they see data and how data is connected to evidence and policy making. Post-workshop interviews to discuss the material that they created. Then walk talks with the regional assembly members across the Southern Regional Assembly. And then finally, regional assembly monthly meetings. So the HNDA policy was launched in 2018 with the National Planning Framework. The National Planning Framework, the NPF, aims to redirect 50% of the population away from Dublin and the Eastern Seaboard towards Ireland's metropolitan cities. These include Galway, Limerick, Cork, and Waterford. Now, it's important to recognize that regionalism and the concept of the urban as an identity or policy domain really does not exist in Ireland. The Southern Regional Assembly, which is this right here, holds 42% of the land mass, and they are charged with developing policy for 3 metropolitan areas. So when I'm walking around and I'm talking to the regional assembly members about how they feel with these new regional plans and metropolitan plans, they say to me, we have been a small little bit adventurous with words, right? The idea that this metropolitan identity doesn't really exist there. Now, the National Planning Framework is what's driving the housing need and demand assessment tool. Essentially, there are 4 components that the local authorities all need to do as part of their local development plan. The first is they're identifying their key housing market drivers. Then they're profiling the housing stock. Then they're estimating future housing need and demand assessment through the HNDA Excel tool, which is what I'm going to go into in a little bit. And then finally, the determining specialist provisions. So accessible wheelchair housing, housing for asylum seekers, travelers, or students and elderly. And they're using these projections when they're writing their local development plan. So this is an Excel sheet that is centrally held. It is informed by 32 different data sets. In Rob's presentation, he showed us some of the different types of data sets that are used. Many of them come from Central Statistics Office, but there are also some that are from revenue, as well as the local authorities themselves putting up information. Essentially, it is central government, though, who is generating the data, or who is analyzing the data, crunching it into an Excel data sheet, and then giving it back to the local authorities to use in their preparation of their housing need and demand assessment. This is a view of this Excel sheet. It has multiple tabs. It's quite complicated. Mostly what I want to focus on is that there is a drop-down option where the local authorities are allowed to select the different types of migrations that will influence the outputs that the Excel sheet gives. So it can be high migration, low migration, business as usual, or 50-50 convergence. This is what works with policy, right? So if you select 50-50 convergence, it's going to distribute population to ensure that your housing need and demand assessment output is coherent with policy. Now, this flexibility is part of what central government states as allowing local authorities to be able to be adapted and to ensure that their local development plan resonates with their needs on the ground. However, any deviation from the 50-50 scenario must be either evidence-based and it must be consistent with guidelines. And in fact, there is a central body that was created when the National Policy Framework came out called the Office of the Planning Regulator, and it is their job to go through the policies, to go through the local development plans and ensure that they adhere to policy. So because of its complication, it makes it quite confusing for the local development, for the local authorities to work through this Excel sheet and inform their local development plans. This is the HNDA implementation timeline. There's a lot of information here, but mostly what I want to focus on is that this is when the policy was released in 2018. Then there were a series of events that occurred much later, such as the Brexit transition, the Ukraine war, the COVID-19 lockdowns, that changed the way the different types of population projections that initially were conceived for Ireland, as well as differentiated where people decided to move because of COVID-19 and work from home policies. But central government never updated their centrally held database, right? There again, making it quite confusing for local authorities to use the HNDA Excel tool to inform their local development plans. And so this led to how complications with the digitalization create openings for these para-state actors. What you see here is I combed through all the local authority development plans to see how many of them actually used a contractor to write their HNDA for them. 23 of them did, 8 of them used their own. Now, government had said that the ease of having an Excel tool would make it so that local authorities could do their own HNDA. But yet that was not the case. As one stakeholder said to me, very few local authorities actually used it themselves and wrote the analysis themselves. Essentially, the tool would have been able to help them do their own housing strategy without having to go to KPMG or different consultancies to assist them. Certain para-state actors also have the capacity to wield more power and territorial influence over others, and they become the main source of local figures. So what you can see here is also that KPMG, which is orange, and then in tandem with LISNI, were the ones who completed most of the HNDAs for the local authorities. So this also demonstrates a type of dominance that certain types of consultants can have, and they become the purveyors of local data. And as one stakeholder said to me, but the other thing that was the quid pro quo, why they wanted to do it, is that they knew, these are consultants, they knew that we had the Housing Observatory's Data Navigator, which meant that we had a kind of archive of factually accurate spatial data on the city from 2018 that had been accurately refreshed every year since then. We were able to legally release that data to KPMG under contract. So this digitalization, the challenges with it, create an opening for consultants to come in and do the work for them, and increasingly local authorities end up depending on these consultants to aid them, which doesn't then allow them to upskill in the different types of policies and rollouts that come out. So consultation with the policy direction and decisions around how growth is organized also did exist. As the local authorities say, the department's role has been very instrumental in moving us towards that evidence base. They themselves would not have imposed this rule on themselves or this policy on themselves. Another stakeholder who said, this was sort of a diktat of saying, here's the figures for you, now stick to them. And it does raise questions about what gets ignored in data flows in different types of
Perfect place